Hello, everybody. Welcome to CripChat, your weekly podcast for everything disability. Today, I have with me Jonathan Cha, Evie J,
Hello.
myself, David D, and today we're going to be talking to Damien Griffiths about NAIDOC Week and Indigenous disability. How are you today, Damien?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to our chat.
Okay. Answer you. Please like and share. If you got any questions, place it in the comment box, please. Onto you, Ibi.
Thank you very much for that, David, and welcome once again, Damien, to our series, show for today, where we'll be talking about a NAIDOC week and also its significance. So over to you, Damien. So, Damien, why exactly is NAIDOC and week, and why is it celebrated?
That's a great question, Ibby. First thing I'd like to do is just acknowledge country. So acknowledge that I'm joining you all today from what we call Warramai country in Newcastle. It's been a lovely sunny day up here, which is a good change because I know we've been copying a lot of weather in Sydney. But at the First Peoples Disability Network, we also like to acknowledge two of our founding elders, Uncle Lester Bostock, proud Bundjalung man, and Auntie Gail Rankin, a proud Nunanjeri Ghana woman, and thank them for their wisdom. NAIDOC Week is about celebrating the lives and the stories of Australia's First Peoples. And it's really critical that we honour our elders, including mob with disability, during this week. And this year's theme is a really important one. It's called Keep the Fires Burning. And it's a really important message, particularly after the referendum result of last year, where it's so important that we keep fighting for the rights of all First Nations people, but in particular First Nations people with disability. And it's been great this week to have the opportunity to talk and participate in community events in various places around the country. A number of our staff have been doing that. And we're very grateful that you've given me the opportunity to come along and have a good yarn with you fellas. So thanks.
It's always a pleasure.
Nice, Jonathan.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, John. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm on Darika land in the Eora Nation. So thank you for that, Damien. And for the
No
viewers
worries.
out there, if you know where your tribe is at, please let us know in the comments. So, Damien, what are the themes and objectives of NAIDOC Week?
Yeah, so as we were saying, this year's theme is keep the fires burning. So that's in recognition that the struggle for the rights of First Nations people is an ongoing battle, as you fellas would know. Um, we had some progress over the years. We've had some positive developments like the 1967 referendum, for example. We've seen some progress in terms of First Nations people and First Nations people with disability getting better access to education and perhaps even employment opportunities. But the truth still is that Australia still has a very long way to go in recognising the human rights of all First Nations Australians, but also First Nations people with disability. So the objective of NAIDOC Week is always about shining a light, if you like, on the situation of First Nations people with disability, so that the rest of the country can understand. Because we would say most Australians still don't have a good understanding of the history of their own country.
Yeah. And it's good that we're having this NAIDOC Week to celebrate and also learn about the history of this beautiful country. Thank you for that, Damien. So, how does NAIDOC Week promote the culture and achievements of Indigenous Australians?
Yeah, that's another great question, Ibby. So it does go through a range of ways. So throughout the country, there's NAIDOC activities that are going on, have been going on all week, which bring local communities together, particularly with a strong local focus. So in Newcastle here, for example, it's an opportunity for Awabakal and Warramai people to come together and share their stories with the wider community across Newcastle. The same thing's happening all around the country. And that's also about promoting a deeper understanding amongst all Australians about the history, the true history of Australia, which, as we all know, started a lot longer ago than 200 odd years ago with the arrival of Captain Cook. As we all know, the culture of First Nations Australians is dated at least 65,000 years now. So that's a long, deep knowledge of this country, and it's a long, deep cultural knowledge. But we often find too, as well, that a lot of our friends from other communities come to these NAIDOC celebrations and also share their cultures with us as well. So that's a really critical part of what we're trying to achieve in Australia as well. We're a multicultural society, and everyone has a right to practice their culture and share it with others, and we like to do the same as well. So
I guess that helps us understand each other.
So true, David. That's it, brother. Yep.
Good stuff. Thank you for that, David. When we talk about Indigenous Australians and disability, Damien, what are some unique challenges faced by Indigenous Australians with disabilities?
Yeah, that's another great question. These are all great questions, fellas. Well, firstly, there's a much higher rate or prevalence of disability amongst First Nations people. So we have a rate of disability that's at least twice that of the rest of the Australian population. And you could relate that to most disability types. So we have much higher rates of, say, amputation, for example, much higher rates of acquired brain injury, higher rates of vision impairment, for example, higher rates of deafness, all of those things. Often they're related to poor health outcomes as well. Most First Nations people with disability live in often extreme poverty as well, particularly those First Nations people with disability who are living in regional remote Australia. There's high rates of homelessness. There's equally high rates of overcrowding, where people, it's not uncommon in regional remote parts of Australia where 20 or more people can live in a home, for example. There's also the unique challenges of a lack of really any meaningful services. So particularly in regional remote Australia. So half of First Nations people with disability live outside of the large centres, the urban centres in Australia. And that means that accessing supports, services is very, very difficult or non-existent at all. So there's some of the unique challenges. We also have very high rates of psychosocial disability, so mental illness, things like depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, are very common, as they are in some other cultures as well. So the challenges are unique and we're often talking about very serious violations of human rights. So access to food, access to shelter, and that's particularly the case in regional remote Australia. And most Australians haven't had that experience. They haven't been out into our regional remote communities enough to see how serious the issue is. But yeah, there's a lot of unique challenges, definitely.
Is there any way of preventing that by education?
Yeah, that's definitely another great question, David. Definitely. So that sort of takes both ways, if you like. One of the things we need to do, and what we do at the First Peoples Disability Network, is try and educate our own people about their rights and entitlements. particularly our own community members with disability, so they can start speaking up for themselves. But equally, we need the rest of Australia to understand and start to learn more about the history of this country, And that's something that is still a problem. If I think about when I went to school, I'm 52 now, and I'm sure some of you fellas could probably relate to this. But when I was at school, and which was in the 80s, when I finished school, there was no mention of blackfellas. Hardly a mention of blackfellas. I can think of one or two isolated stories, but the history. When you learn history, it started from when Cook arrived, and even then there was no real mention of blackfellas, So, but if I look at my daughter's experience at school now, it's quite different. They do acknowledgement of country, and there's been some progress.
My daughter also tells me that all we do is learn about Aborigines and at school.
Yep. It's. I think it's gradually changing for the better. So, but it's taken a long time, before it's starting to become,
I guess,
a bit more mainstream.
But it's going in the right direction.
Yep.
Thank you for that. How do cultural perspectives influence the experience of disability within Indigenous communities?
Yeah, great question again, Ibi. These are wonderful questions, fellas. I really appreciate them. One of the things that's really important to know that in traditional language, we don't have a comparable word to disability. So we often don't use the language of disability. We tend to talk about disability in an impairment-based way, which is the right way to do it. Brother's a bit slower than someone else, cousin doesn't hear too well, uncle doesn't quite understand. They're not said in negative ways. They're just sort of things you need to know so we can support our community members. The other thing is we've always known disability as part of the human experience. And the way we can prove that is that there's been a fairly recent discovery in a major archaeological site in Lake Mungo in New South Wales, where some archaeologists have discovered what they say is a single male footprint. And the theory is that this is a one-legged man who's also using a stick and participating in a hunt, they believe, and actually moving at significant speed. And they actually have dated this single footprint at 25,000 years old. So that shows that we always had a way of including people with disability in what we do. It's also quite common for many of our traditional healers to be blind, for example, or there's evidence now that shows that we've had forms of sign language in existence for many thousands of years. So we've always known disability as part of being human. So we actually say we've got a lot to offer the rest of Australian society about how to be inclusive.
Interesting. David, can you share some statistics or facts about disability prevalence among Indigenous Australians?
Yeah, so the 2019 census concluded that 45% of First Nations people have some form of disability or long-term health conditions. So, as you know, if we take the Australian figure of 19% of Australians can be considered as people with disability or having a long-term health condition. So we double that and a little bit more, and that's where we get the result. It's actually considered a conservative figure, though, because it doesn't include a measure on the prevalence of psychosocial disability. So we would say that things like depression and anxiety, for example, are quite normalised in our community. So it's possible that figure is in fact much higher. We have a much higher rates of diabetes, for example, much higher rates of other sort of glaucoma, for example, otitis media, which is glue ear. They're much higher rates in our communities, but they're all fairly preventable disabilities, unfortunately.
Yeah. Could that be towards because of diet also and what people eat?
Definitely, David. Definitely. So, as our as access to traditional foods has changed, it's meant that people's diet has changed for the worse, really, and that is definitely a factor about the increased rates of diabetes. So, the introduction of Western food. Um, has caused that. It's quite common, actually. It happens as well in the Pacific as well, where traditional foods and traditional diet has been sort of overtaken, if you like, by and we're all guilty of that, the junk food and all that kind of stuff, and that's caused problems as well.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you for that, Damien. Now, focusing on your personal stories and experiences, can you share your personal story and experiences as an Indigenous Australian with a disability?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up around a profoundly hearing impaired grandmother. So for me, disability wasn't anything particularly unusual. It's just how Nan. It's just Nan. That's Nan. And but I did see the isolation she experienced and how dependent she was on us as family to support her. I've also got a diagnosis myself of a lot of these wonderful labels, but generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, OCD, um, and all those sort of labels. I'm luckier than most mob, though. I can manage that quite well. I can get access to good supports, the medication that I need, and that helps me a great deal. So I'm luckier than most First Nations people with disability because I can get access to those supports. A lot of our mob with psychosocial disability can't do that. So, but that has informed me as well that, a lot of us move through life with various mental health challenges, if you like, and being able to get support for it makes all the difference in how you can move through the world.
Interesting. Now, thank you for that, Damien. Thank you for sharing. How has your cultural background influenced your experiences of disability?
Yeah, so it's what we like to say in our communities is disabilities will sort of come as you are, really. The idea of labeling people is, we would say, a Western construct. And as we all know, I'm sure of us on this podcast, gentlemen, disability's got so many labels, it's unbelievable, isn't it? So, cerebral palsy, acquired brain injury, mental health, psychosocial disability, autism, intellectual disability, the list is endless, isn't it? So, whereas we just move through the world of, well, this is how this person, we don't give them a label. It's just it's just how they are, come as you are. So often what happens in our communities is, generally speaking, mob with disability don't usually experience discrimination in their own community, but once they get outside that community, that's when discrimination starts. I don't know if that's something you fellas can relate to, but it's like when a young Aboriginal kid with disability, when he's at home amongst his community, he's accepted, no issues. When the moment he turns up to school, though, the trouble starts.
They start pointing out.
They
start pointing them
start.
out.
Yeah, the labels start, and then the discrimination starts, and away you go. So, we say we've got a culture of inclusion. It's natural to us to be inclusive.
Can that be due to actual to being educated? Can that be due to education?
Yeah, it's just kind of always how things have been. That people are people, and people come in all shapes and sizes and in all sorts of different ways, and that's part of the human experience. And We've kind of always known that in our old ways and in the old culture, and it's unfortunately not the way society is structured though today. Eh? So you've kind of you've almost got to be, and these are not my thoughts, but you've almost got to be like a productive economic person to be able to be valued, and that's not the way we move through the world.
Yeah, and interesting. Thank you, Damien. Well said. What have been some of your significant achievement and contributions?
Oh, geez, I don't like talking about myself, brother. So I did win a Australian Human Rights Award 2014. Yeah, but I mean, I prefer to sort of acknowledge the honour I've had of helping to create and grow the First Peoples Disability Network as the national peak organisation over the last 24 years, representing mob with disability. And being a part of that and leading that is hopefully going to be a legacy for mob with disability for a long time to come.
Cool. No, thank you for that. We'll now move on to advocacy and representation and what that's all about. So, Damien, what role do advocacy and representation play in improving the lives of Indigenous Australians with disabilities?
Yeah, great question, Ibby. Look, everything really, to be honest. So when it comes to advocacy, we do individual advocacy and we also do systemic advocacy. So individual advocacy is obviously where we help individual community members with disability to get an outcome for their disability-related needs. Systemic advocacy is where we do anything from writing submissions to lobbying politicians to talking in the media. All of those things are critical to telling the stories of mob with disability to try and create a more positive life for mob with disability. So the role that advocacy and representation plays is critical. We've got some amazing advocates at FPDN. We've got some brilliant spokespeople who are mob with disability themselves. Nothing more powerful than, as you fellas all know, than people speaking for themselves, and that's what we're always about.
Awesome. Keep up the great work that you guys do. Building on that, can you highlight any organizations or individuals who have been leading advocacy efforts?
Well, you three gentlemen today are. You fellas are doing amazing work, and what you do is critical. And so you fellas, there's also a number of really good organisations out there that speak up for Australians with disability. People with Disability Australia is a great organisation. National Ethnic Disability Alliance, Women with Disability Australia. They're all really important organisations, and there's a number of very powerful individuals who are great spokespeople. But what you fellas are doing is leading advocacy and leading efforts. So that's why I'm so thrilled to be here. And I think the more people can see this podcast and participate in this podcast, the better, because you fellas are leading the way. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. It's much appreciated, and we're very glad, for you to join us. And keep up on the work that we do, advocating for our community. So, in saying that, how can the broader community support these advocacy efforts?
Yeah, I think it's about learning about the situation of Australians with disability and including mob with disability. I still think a lot of Australians, and this came out through the Disability Royal Commission, that I don't think a lot of Australians, unless they've got a personal experience around disability, maybe a family member or themselves, really understand the lives of Australians with disability and how serious the human rights for Australians with disability, the lack of human rights, if you like. I think more Australians need to educate themselves, actually, and then become allies and speak up as well about disability rights.
That's why I say education is needed in the schools for disability.
For sure. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more, David. I agree completely. You're so right. The lack of, it starts there, doesn't it?
That's at school.
Yeah.
And it moves on
Yeah.
to their parents.
Yes.
The children learn and they teach their parents.
Yes. Beautifully said. I agree. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. We're talking now about the key challenges and barriers. So, Damien, what are some of the key challenges and barriers that are faced by Indigenous Australians with disabilities?
Yeah, definitely. Again, that issue of poverty, material poverty. So, particularly in regional remote Australia, many of our people with disability live in quite extreme poverty. It's comparable to the poverty experienced by people in developing countries, and a lot of Australians would not know that. Homelessness, lack of access to services, poor access to health services. Access to appropriate diet, appropriate food. There are some of our communities around Australia, again, most Australians wouldn't realise this, that don't have access to clean water, don't have access to hot water, don't have access to reliable electrical supplies, for example. A lot of Australians wouldn't believe that happens, but it does. It most definitely does. And so we need to recognise that sometimes, but that's not the case for every community, but in regional remote Australia especially, the situation can be very, very serious.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Damien. So, building on that, how do these issues, like access to healthcare, education, and employment, affect the community as a whole?
Yeah, well, that's if you don't have access to the basics of life, so being access to good quality healthcare. If you don't have an access to an education, unfortunately, there is still a high number of young First Nations people with disability who don't, access an education in any meaningful way, or certainly don't complete an education. And sadly, there are not many mob with disability who are in employment. So there's still a very long way to go in that sense. Having said that, though, there is progress. There's no doubt there's been progress, but not quick enough. We need to do more.
Yeah, so talking about that, what can be done to address these challenges and promote equality?
Yeah, so we need more investment into healthcare, health supports. We do have a number of what are called Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations that are located all around the country, and they do a vital job. They do a really critical job in improving the health outcomes of First Nations people. But we definitely need to have a more accessible education system. That relates to all young kids with disability. That's not just for First Nation children with disability. All Australian children with disability have a right to an education. And unfortunately, the education system still has a long way to go in providing, properly accessible education, which I'm sure you fellas would agree with. And we need to address the very serious poverty that experienced by many First Nations people, particularly mob living in regional remote Australia.
Yeah, for sure. Well said that, Damien. And I totally agree. We'll go back to, celebrating NAIDOC Week and what that's all about. Celebrating achievements, contributions, the amazing work that advocates are doing out there. Damien, can you share some success stories and achievements of Indigenous Australians with disabilities?
There's so many, and you fellas would have stories as well in the communities that you represent, I'm sure. But I can think of so many of my colleagues and leaders over the years who are First Nations persons with disability who are achieving extraordinary things. The most freshest in my mind, there's always a lot of stories in this space, but my good friend Jake Briggs has set up his own. Jake is a Wanneroo fellow who's quadriplegic. He set up his own NDIS business for mob with disability and doing an amazing job. He's brilliant. Every one of our board members who are all First Nations people with disability have achieved extraordinary things, won awards, built organisations, completed tertiary education. There's always so many positive experiences, and we've got some athletes in the Paralympics this year, for example, as well. And there's so many endless stories. We've got another one that's fresh in my mind is Gurumul, who was, a blind musician and songman who was an amazing artist. Unfortunately, he's now passed, but there's so many stories and so many great achievements.
Sorry about that. Thank you for that, Damien. Yeah, I think Jake's been on this podcast before, so that's up to you,
Awesome.
Jake, if you're watching this.
Awesome.
Damien, how are these individuals making a difference in their communities and beyond?
Yeah, they're doing it by showing the way, showing leadership, showing how they can create and lead. They're also strong and powerful spokespeople, and every time they speak with power and passion, they are making a change in their community and hopefully making a change for a better Australia as well. They're all extraordinary individuals, and they're the people we need more of in our society, people that are strong and are here to try and change Australia for the better.
Awesome. Sounds good. Then what can we learn from their experiences and contributions?
I think we can learn things like how to be inclusive, how to naturally be inclusive. Like I said earlier, we are a naturally inclusive people. First Nations Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are naturally inclusive, and we have to share that with the rest of Australia so that Australia can be better at inclusion. That's always been the blackfella way. And I think if more Australians can learn about, the Black history of Australia, they'll learn and come to realise that it's a beautiful culture that is endearing and values and understands people. And I think that's probably the thing that would be the greatest learning for the rest of Australia, I think.
Yeah, no, interesting. Well said, Damien. Thank you for that. We'll now move on to the role of culture and community. So, Damien, how does Indigenous culture play a role in supporting people with disability?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ibi. So in traditional culture, we have men's business and women's business. You've probably heard of those phrases before, I imagine. And Indigenous culture is really critical in understanding, the role that men and women play in supporting community members with disability. In more traditional communities, the role of who provides support is really clearly defined. Certain people can have relationships with others and not others, for that matter. In communities where that's less traditional, for want of a better term, then it tends to be done a little bit more differently. But whatever the way things are done, it's always about respecting culture. But again, being a culture of inclusion, the idea of someone being different or lesser of a person because they have a disability just doesn't exist in our communities. And I think that's what we're most proud of and what we want to share with the rest of Australia. That idea that, you come as you are. We all come as we are. And whatever way that is who we are. So.
Interesting. Thank you for that, Damien. Building on what you said, what are some traditional practices or community initiatives that support disability inclusion?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, it's quite common for traditional healers, or even people that have knowledge of medicine, for example, in communities. Quite common for them to be blind people. That's not unheard of. Very, very common. The traditional practices of our traditional sign languages that go back many thousands of years are all ways that people were included. People with disability were included. And also that idea of, which I mentioned with Mungo Man, of creating, supports for people so that it could participate in community life. So the idea of, something dated 25,000 years ago where a person had a stick and they were able to participate in a hunt, even though they had one leg, is a perfect example of some of the traditional things that have been done in the past. And also some of the famous, more contemporary sort of heroes, if you like, of in Indigenous rights. There's a lot of evidence to show that Windrain, for example, who was a guerrilla, or Pemulwuy as well, Pemulwuy, who was a warrior in the Hawkesbury River region and was very effective in some of his tactics when the English were trying to settle the area. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that he, in fact, may have had a disability. He actually was wounded quite significantly, but still was very much a leader in his community and seen as a warrior and a strong person. So, yeah, traditional practice has been a critical part of disability inclusion.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Moving on, how can we bridge cultural understanding and promote inclusion?
That's a great question, Evie. These questions today have been wonderful. I really appreciate the thought that's gone into them, gentlemen. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a question, isn't it, for Australia? Like, how can we all come together as Australians and understand each other, eh? And it's really important that Australians understand First Nations culture, the oldest living, surviving culture on Earth. I mean, if we stop and think about that for a moment, that's an extraordinary thing, eh? That's a really positive and powerful thing. But also, I need to understand other people's cultures as well. That's a natural part of inclusion. I need to understand the culture of Chinese Australians. I need to understand the culture of, my Lebanese friends, my Muslim friends, my Jewish friends, whatever. We've all got to come together and learn and sit with each other, and that's how you get to know one another, eh? And
I guess learning and accepting each other is a good thing.
Exactly.
Sure is.
We've got more in common than we don't, eh?
You know what I'm thinking of? Is there an actual cafe that has Aboriginal food?
There's been a few restaurants established over the years. There's a couple in Redfern that are off the ground again. I think they're up and running again. There were a couple of restaurants down in Melbourne that did quite well. I think they're still around. And in more regional parts of the country, you definitely do find cafes run by Aboriginal people. Not so much in Sydney, unfortunately, but there's a few around. There's a few around.
It'll be interesting
Just
to
gonna
to
look them up.
learn food.
Yeah, exactly. I was actually a funny story. I was just out in Burke last week, and we were having some emu and kangaroo, and it was good. Yeah, it was good. I haven't had emu before, not too many times anyway. But yeah, it's there's a lot of interesting. It's interesting too. There's more and more mainstream restaurants starting to embrace traditional food. Like you see it around a bit more now, like your finger lime stuff or your lemon myrtle
Yeah,
and all
like
that
we
kind of
got a
stuff.
lot of nice, interesting. Like be sure to check them out. And
Yeah.
that's it. Thank you for sharing, Daniel. So we're now going to looking ahead, so our future direction. And so, what are your hopes and aspirations for the future in terms of disability inclusion within Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I would hope that our culture of inclusion, the natural way that we are inclusive of our own community members with disability, can be shared and learnt from by the rest of Australian society. That's what I hope for. But I also hope that our people, First Nations people with disability, get access to education, like we've been talking about, get access to good health services, get access to the supports that they need and they're entitled to, and that their human rights are recognised and that they get to live the life that they want to live.
Interesting. Thank you, Damien. So, how can NAIDOC Week continue to support and highlight the experiences of Indigenous Australians with disabilities?
Yeah, I think the challenge for NAIDOC Week going forward is that mob with disability have focus on them every year. This year's theme of "Keep the Fire Burning" is it needs to be inclusive of mob with disability, and every NAIDOC year needs to have a strong focus on mob with disability, and we need to be able to share those experiences even beyond NAIDOC Week. So NAIDOC Week's really important, but every week should be a NAIDOC Week.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. Why not? Sounds good. Sounds good. Now, thank you for that, Damien. And finally, what actions can listeners take to support these efforts year round?
So I think, like we've been talking about, gentlemen, is educating yourself about the history of the First Nations history of the area you live in is really good. That's a good start for people to do. Keep an eye on our website so you can see some of the issues that we're advocating for and show you support through social media and other ways. We're always happy to get donations if people want to do that. That's also a really practical thing as well. But I think educating yourself about the situation for mob with disability is really, really critical.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for the Damien. It's very important that we as a multicultural community come together, learn about different cultures that are out there, connect with people, hear their stories, hear their experiences. They're very rich. Speaking of that, thank you, Damien, for joining us today and sharing your rich experience and knowledge and talking about NAIDOC Week and what that's all about.
Thank you very much, Damien.
Jonathan,
Thank you.
do you have anything you want to add?
Just thank you very much, Ibi. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jonathan. It's been a real pleasure, gentlemen, and really
And
enjoyed the conversation. It's brilliant.
if we ever need to get you back on, or you want us to talk about anything else about disability, let us know, and we'll gladly happy to have you back on.
We'd love to do that, David. Good on you. Appreciate it, Ibby and Jonathan. Thank you, David. It's been great.
You've been
So once
watching
again,
CripChat,
it's
your
been a
weekly
pleasure to have
podcast,
you on
Everything
the.
Disability.
Sorry about that, David. I was just saying it's been a pleasure to have you on the show, Damien, and we look forward to connect with you in the future to talk more about NAIDOC and what that's all about. So thank you very much, Damien. Thank you, John. Thank you, David. Do you wanna end it, David?
You've been watching CripChat, your weekly podcast, Everything Disability. Tune in next week for more.
Goodbye for now.
Goodbye for now.
Thank you. Thanks, fellas. Have a good weekend. That was great.
Have a great weekend too.
See you all. Thanks very much. Bye-bye. Bye.